In the spring of 1940, Norway fell with a swiftness that startled Europe. The German invasion, meticulously planned and executed with speed, shattered the fragile neutrality the Scandinavian kingdom had hoped to preserve. Within weeks, key ports were seized, the government displaced, and the monarchy forced into exile. The fjords that had once stood as symbols of isolation became corridors of occupation. Yet in this alternate course of events, history did not settle so easily. Instead of dispersing or fleeing abroad in full, the Norwegian government withdrew into the vast interior, retreating beyond the immediate grasp of German columns. From valleys veiled in snow and forests that stretched unbroken for miles, it chose resistance. The decision altered the psychological landscape of the war in the north. Rather than presenting the occupiers with a pacified coastline and a compliant administration, Norway became a fractured battlefield of authority. German forces held the major ports and urban centers, but beyond the immediate reach of their garrisons, the interior stirred. Civil servants, military officers, and local leaders reorganized under extraordinary conditions. Communication lines were improvised through couriers and clandestine transmitters. The government, though displaced, maintained continuity. It issued decrees, coordinated supplies, and above all declared that the struggle would not be relinquished. For Berlin, the strategic logic of occupying Norway had been clear. Control of the coastline secured vital sea lanes, protected shipments of Swedish iron ore, and offered naval and air bases projecting power into the North Atlantic. The swift seizure of ports had been intended to deny Britain any foothold, but the German High Command had anticipated a brief operation followed by stabilization. It did not anticipate a prolonged inland resistance sustained by a functioning government. What had been conceived as a protective shield for the Reich's northern flank threatened to become a drain on manpower and material. The geography of Norway became an ally to its defenders. Mountains formed natural fortresses, and narrow passes could be held by small units with determination and knowledge of the terrain. Rail lines and roads, limited even in peacetime, were vulnerable to disruption. Norwegian officers who had evaded capture regrouped scattered units, blending conventional tactics with irregular warfare. The line between soldier and civilian blurred as farmers, fishermen, and students joined local resistance formations. Their aim was not immediate victory but denial. If Germany could not command the entirety of the coastline, its northern strategy would remain incomplete. The occupation authorities responded with efforts to consolidate control. Garrisons were reinforced, patrols extended, and collaborators cultivated. Yet every extension of German presence into the interior required supply convoys threading through difficult terrain. Each bridge guarded demanded soldiers who might otherwise have served elsewhere. In attempting to impose order, the occupiers discovered the limits of their reach. Coastal cities functioned under strict supervision, but inland communities became contested spaces where authority shifted with circumstance. The persistence of armed resistance within Norway reshaped Allied calculations. Britain, observing that the country had not been entirely subdued, perceived opportunity. Supplies were dispatched through covert maritime routes, and advisors slipped ashore to assist coordination. The Royal Navy found renewed purpose in harassing German shipping along segments of coast that were no longer secure. The North Atlantic Campaign, already a struggle of endurance, absorbed this new variable. German naval planners faced uncertainty, unsure which stretches of the rugged shoreline could reliably host submarines and surface vessels without fear of sabotage. Sweden, maintaining its delicate neutrality, watched developments with apprehension. A Norway divided between coastal occupation and inland resistance complicated regional stability. The iron ore routes through Narvik, so essential to Germany's war industry, became vulnerable not only to Allied intervention but to Norwegian disruption. Each successful act of sabotage resonated beyond its immediate effect. It signaled that control was contested, that the Reich's northern bastion rested on unstable ground. Within Norway itself, the moral consequences of sustained resistance were profound. The government's continued presence within national territory reinforced legitimacy. It became a symbol that sovereignty endured despite invasion. Schools in remote districts taught children under the banner of a state still fighting. Clergy delivered sermons that intertwined faith with perseverance. The occupation sought to impose a new political order. Yet its authority remained visibly incomplete. Propaganda struggled to persuade a population that could hear, through whispered reports, that their leaders remained active within reach. German commanders faced a dilemma. To crush the resistance decisively would require extensive operations across inhospitable terrain, risking heavy commitments in a theater not central to immediate offensives elsewhere in Europe. To tolerate partial control, however, invited continued disruption. As the wider war expanded, France collapsing in the west, the Battle of Britain unfolding in the skies, the resources tied down in Norway became a subject of internal debate. Some argued that a harsher approach would pacify the country. Others feared that escalation would only deepen the quagmire. Winter intensified the struggle. Snow sealed high passes and slowed movement for both sides. Yet those accustomed to the climate possessed advantage. Resistance units navigated frozen landscapes with familiarity, striking isolated outposts and retreating into concealment. German troops, though disciplined and equipped, confronted an environment indifferent to their presence. Morale fluctuated as months passed without clear resolution. Reports to Berlin emphasized progress. Yet privately officers acknowledged that absolute control remained elusive. The presence of an active Norwegian government on its own soil carried diplomatic weight. In exile, governments in exile often relied heavily on foreign patrons. In this scenario, Norway's leadership could claim not merely symbolic continuity but operational command within national borders. Allied leaders cited Norway as proof that occupation need not equal submission. The narrative of resistance became a rallying point in broadcasts transmitted across Europe. For populations under Axis control, the knowledge that a small nation continued to fight from within offered a subtle, persistent encouragement. As Germany prepared for its Eastern Campaign in 1941, the unresolved situation in Norway imposed strategic friction. Divisions stationed in Scandinavia were divisions unavailable elsewhere. Air units assigned to guard extended coastlines could not be redeployed without risk. The Kriegsmarine, tasked with protecting supply routes and suppressing coastal interference, found its resources stretched. Though Norway did not become a decisive battlefield in terms of massive engagements, it evolved into a theater of attrition measured in logistics, morale, and opportunity cost. Over time, the resistance matured, networks expanded, intelligence flowed more efficiently, and coordination with Allied commands improved. Acts of sabotage targeted infrastructure critical to German operations. Each success reinforced recruitment and hardened resolve. The occupation authorities retaliated with arrests and reprisals, seeking to intimidate communities suspected of aiding insurgents. Yet repression often deepened resentment rather than extinguishing it. The conflict within Norway became less about territorial lines and more about endurance. By 1943 and 1944, as the tide of war began to shift elsewhere, the strategic significance of an unconquered Norwegian interior became increasingly apparent. Allied planners contemplating operations in Western Europe considered the northern theater not merely a diversion but a potential lever. German forces, uncertain whether larger incursions might emerge from persistent resistance, maintained substantial garrisons. What had begun as a rapid campaign to secure strategic assets evolved into a prolonged commitment with diminishing returns. When the final phase of the war approached and Germany's broader position deteriorated, Norway's sustained defiance hastened the erosion of occupation authority. Communication between coastal strongholds and inland districts frayed. German units, isolated and aware of the Reich's impending collapse, adopted a defensive posture. The Norwegian government, having endured years in austere conditions, prepared to reassert comprehensive control. Liberation, when it came, did not represent the resurrection of a dormant state but the culmination of an unbroken line of resistance.
Thanks for watching. If you found this journey into alternate history fascinating,